Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Vinson. You can find us on other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. Well, thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. I know typically we do our episodes on Saturdays, but circumstances have brought us to doing it this Sunday afternoon, and I guess it's a great way to spend a Lord's Day afternoon is by talking about spiritual things. So hopefully this will be edifying for your Lord's Day, and I think will be a good use of our time today. So we're going to be looking at, there's been some discussion on YouTube from Dr. Gavin Ortland and Dr. who falls within the Baptist tradition, and you have Dr. Jordan Cooper from the Lutheran tradition talking about high church, low church traditions and Protestantism, and having some discussion on their platforms regarding that. I found it interesting in listening to Cooper's take on this. I think because there are things that he said that I think are applicable to us Baptists. I'm of the Reformed, particular Baptist tradition, and I think some of the criticisms that he had, and he was very gracious in his video, pointing out some things that he sees, and I think he's right, at least in some of these areas as it relates to us Baptists, and I think it provides some time for us to have some self-reflection. And I think from our perspective on the show, and as it relates to some who are in the recovery movement in our circles, in the particular Baptist side of things, I think we have been saying these kind of things for a long time, to some extent, maybe not in the categories of high church versus low church, but as we go through this today, I think we'll see some of the things that I'm referring to, especially as it relates to recovery and going back to our confessional tradition. I think that when you're looking at Baptist, broadly speaking, I think some of the things that Cooper brings up are applicable and I think can be helpful for us as we look at some of these reflections as it relates to our tradition. And so I think that Cooper does have some words that bite for us Reformed Baptists. And I think as a high churchman, if you will, and when we're talking about high church versus low church, if you're looking at it in a broad aspect, I think you're looking at it more like you have a very structured liturgy. Liturgy is considered very important and it's front and center in a lot of ways. And then you have these low church Protestants who would be, I think Baptists would fall into that more so, and maybe your broader evangelicals who really don't see the order of worship as important, the liturgy of worship as that important, and it's more about the experience. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today and why I think we can, as particular Baptists, make the claim to high churchmanship in some sense, maybe not in the absolute term if you're looking at it broadly in the general use of the term, but I think there is a sense where it can be used of us in relation to what Cooper is bringing out here. But I think this can be helpful for us as we go along. And I think there's something as we have this discussion that we as particular Baptists need to humbly ask ourselves. Do we follow in the core tenets of the tradition that we claim to follow? Do we follow in the core tenets of the tradition that we claim to follow? Those things that form our belief system today as particular Baptists, do I hold to that in name only, or do I believe in those core tenets? Is 1689 just something that I throw on my Twitter bio because, I'm part of a 1689 church, maybe they're loosely affiliated with the 1689, but there might be all these other things over here that contradict core aspects of that confession. Do we hold to that confessional tradition at least in the core tenets of it, and hold to those Baptist distinctives? And also all those things that Christians unify on in the universal church. But And while doing this, I don't think from a Baptist perspective makes one high church from Cooper's perspective, at least in the broad sense. I think that question and that type of thinking should drive us as Reformed, particular Baptists, to seek to be biblically consistent with our tradition. And I think that's something that we Baptists don't like. We don't like tradition. And I think that unfortunately has caused a lot of the theological problems that you see in our circles today. There's this suspicion of tradition. So I would recommend, I'm going to play some of the video here, and I would recommend going and listening to it in its entirety. I think it's a very helpful video. And of course, Dr. Cooper is a confessional Lutheran. He would not identify with the progressive Lutheranism. You see affirming homosexuality, having female pastors who clearly are not historical Lutherans. Cooper, I think, would fall more in line with that historical flavor of Lutheranism and looking at it from the standards of the Augsburg Confession, the Book of Concord, and those other confessional standards that really define Lutheranism historically. So, I do recommend the guy. Obviously, we have disagreements. I'm a Baptist, he's a Lutheran, but I think there's a lot of things that overlap that can be helpful. I mean, heck, on this video, I don't know if I'll play it, but he even gives a shout out to James Dolezal for his work on divine simplicity. I mean, there's definitely things that we can agree on at a fundamental level, and there's certainly things we have serious disagreements on that we can discuss. But as it relates to what we're talking about here, and in general, I would recommend Cooper for those things that we would agree on. Anyways, let's take a look. Hopefully this is going to work. I'm using OBS Studio, and OBS is one of those programs you have to fine tune just right or it will not work. So hopefully we don't have any audio issues here with the video. But I want to play some of this and kind of have a little bit of back and forth. I don't think we'll play the whole video, but I think there's some things that we can talk about here.
Examples of that tradition, when we don't tend to do the same thing when it comes to Lutherans, or when it comes to Anglicans, or when it comes to Presbyterians. And I think that there is an element to this that is more than just taking the worst examples, though that is something that happens, and I think that's something that happens across the board. I see that people doing that with Lutherans as well. They grab onto the most kind of antinomian forms of Lutheranism and then define Lutheranism by that. I know
Now, just to give a little bit of context. So Cooper here is talking about how there is a tendency sometimes for those criticizing Baptists, or even on the Lutheran side. I just mentioned there are Lutherans that are more progressive, that believe in homosexuality, female pastors, etc. And that someone might define Lutherans by that outlier. And the same thing happens for Baptists. Some people might take the wacko King James only people out in the woods and think that's what Baptists are and write us all off. And he's trying to, kind of find what really is Protestantism. What does that look like? And he's kind of leading this into the discussion about how Baptists tend to be kind of all over the place as it relates to what they believe. It's hard to define what a Baptist is in a general sense as a body because of the lack of confessionalism. That's really where he's going with this, so we'll continue here.
Reformed seminaries that do that because of the books that they assign or articles that they assign to understand Lutheran views on things. So I think that's a problem kind of all around. But I think that here's the difficulty that I have with the Baptist tradition in particular. If someone wants to, say, align Lutheranism with its most kind of liberal or progressive branch or branches, we have a way of kind of judging whether or not that is a valid expression of Lutheranism, whether it's a consistent expression of Lutheranism, and that is that we have a confessional tradition. And so when I'm speaking about Lutheranism, I often say confessional Lutheranism. I'm identifying the doctrine that was in our confession. So we have a standard whereby we can judge whether or not a particular congregation or pastor is actually being faithful to the inherited Lutheran tradition, and that is we have our confessional tradition. The same thing is true of Presbyterians, right? So if you have a Presbyterian church that maybe has Presbyterian in their name, but they don't hold to anything in the Westminster Confession, or they deny half of the things that it says, I have a clear standard, right, where I could say, okay, well, this has a Presbyterian name, in the church, but when I look at the actual dogmatic or doctrinal standards, and I look at the congregation, I can judge the standards or practices of the congregation by what the Westminster Confession, the Westminster Standards actually says.
Now, this is very important when it comes to just confessionalism in general, right? This is why confessionalism is so important, because it gives a standard by which churches can hold or reject certain doctrines. It holds their elders accountable, it holds their people accountable. There's one standard by which they can refer to and hold their doctrine to. Of course, no one in any of these confessional traditions believes that their confessions are infallible, but inasmuch as they are consistent with the word, they believe they are teaching the word. We believe that these are good summaries of, each according to their respective traditions. They're good summaries of what the Bible teaches. And so you see with Dr. Cooper, you see a confessional tradition that he follows. The Augsburg Confession is his confession that he would hold to. The Presbyterians or Westminster Reformed, Particular Baptists, the 1689 London. So you can see where he's going with this here, right? Where you're looking at these different streams of traditions that you can judge someone against. Where the Presbyterian, if they're not believing the Westminster, you can see that they're off and they're not following in that tradition. A confessional Lutheran, if they're off, they're not following that tradition. Baptists, on the other hand, well, we're kind of all over the place, and he's going to get to that in a second.
And so we have a way to define our traditions apart from just any church who happens to have this name stuck on it, right? Because unfortunately, all of our traditions have their forms of expression that aren't consistent with those traditions, including Rome as well. So I don't think it's just the case, and the East. I don't think it's the case just with Protestant churches. So we all have those people that aren't bound to the actual doctrine that they say that they take a vow to teach according to. With Baptists, that's just not quite the case, and I think that's the difficulty when it comes to Baptists. Now you do have, of course, Baptist confessions of faith. You have the 1689 London Baptist Confession, which is the most well-known, but you have earlier Baptist confessions as well, in 1646. Oh my gosh, that year might be wrong. And I know there was a whole kind of movement among Baptists at one time.
It's close enough, Dr. Cooper, 1644, then 1646, and 1650s, but you got one of the editions at least.
I'm arguing for like this thing that they called New Covenant theology that was taken from the earlier Baptist confessions and stuff, the later ones. And then you also have the Baptist Faith and Message, which is like the binding document of the SBC. It's very vague, though. So the thing is, you do have some confessions within Baptist churches, but there's no singular confessional tradition in the same way. And so this is why you have your Free Will Baptists, you have your Particular Baptists, and there isn't a unifying confession that defines what a Baptist is exactly. So if you look at the largest, more conservative, is the largest Baptist church in the U.S., but a church that is intentionally conservative in a theological sense, meaning that it is a church that holds to the authority of Scripture very strongly. The Southern Baptist Convention doesn't really have a very strong standard of statement of faith, and this is why you have all of these various movements and debates within the Southern Baptist Convention about.
This is actually a really good point, because Andy Stanley, Stephen Furtick, I don't know if they still are part of the SBC. I don't think so, but they were, and they were allowed to do what they do, or did what they did within the bounds of the SBC. And I think it goes back to that point about the Baptist Faith and Message being so vague and very surface level. It's not a very clear-cut document like you would find in an Augsburg Confession, in a Westminster Confession, in the 1689, where you have these very clear, defined, chiseled out theological definitions that don't leave much, if any, room for interpretation. So, he acknowledges that, there are Baptist streams like us who we believe in the 1689. We have some kind of confessional tradition, but he's talking about Baptists as a whole in terms of their identity and their historical stream There is not a unifying confession by which we can kind of get behind, if you will, or at least historically. And then he's gonna tie this into our ecclesiology and the fact that we do have this strong sense of independency as Baptists. And I think there is some, uh, you could make an argument that there is some validity to that, in as much as when you do have a focus on individual churches and local church autonomy, that there will be somewhat of a siloing that goes on. And I think that is not really I wouldn't call it a problem within the Baptist ecclesiology. I would call that a problem in the siloing. It's taking the understanding of Baptist ecclesiology too far, because historically Baptists have been associated with one another. And I think you see this very, and I didn't bring it. I don't have it. I meant to have my first London Baptist Confession, the 1646 that he referenced earlier, which does talk about churches coming together. And of course, the 1689 talks about associationalism, and associationalism can help to remove a lot of those siloings, right? Of course, associations do not have authority over local churches, but they do bring local Baptist churches together to deal with certain issues that might arise, to maybe pool resources. But it keeps, and of course, these associated churches are working under the head of a certain body of doctrine, right? They're subscribing to something, to some kind of confession of. Oh, you brought it up. Thank you. My wife is listening, and she brought me my confession of faith up here. Um, Thank you, Desiree. Appreciate it. Maybe she can be my producer. Okay, I had it marked. Interchurch dependency. This is the 1646 First London Baptist Confession of Faith, and this is what Cooper referenced earlier. It says, and although the particular congregations be distinct in several bodies, every one is a compact and knit city within itself, yet are they all to walk by one rule of truth, so also they, by all means convenient, are to have the counsel and help one of another, if necessity require it, as members of one body in the common faith under Christ their head. So the local body autonomy is not taken away. The keys of the kingdom for each church is not taken away. However, there is a sense where there has to be associationalism. Together, Christians are not working in silos. While each local church focuses on the needs of that local church in accordance with the ecclesiastical rules of Scripture, they are to come together and help one another, right? And so I do think that there is this siloing that goes on, and I think that's why you see this lack of unified confessionalism. I mean, when you're talking about it in relation to particular Baptists, you had two streams of Baptists, right? You had uh, General Baptists who may have been considered Anabaptists, I don't know, but you did have Anabaptists mostly prior to that, who particular Baptists were not part of. They clearly distinguished themselves from that. But General Baptists had their own critical theological differences, and particular Baptists had their own theological differences. They could not unite under one confession because they had fundamentally different views of salvation, at least how salvation is affected to all people. And of course, you had differences with political theory, political theology, and we've talked about particular Baptist political theology on the show before. But one thing that you see is fundamental differences in theology. You have particular Baptists coming out of the Puritan stream, the Puritan separatist stream, separating from the Church of England in the early 17th century. And General Baptists also were separatists, but they held very different theological views. Particular Baptists associated with the general Reformed understanding of soteriology as it relates to the Puritans and the Reformed, while the General Baptists veered off into, denying a particular redemption and things like that, and having other problems. So you don't see this unification of Baptists up front. You don't see that up front. And really, with these confessions, especially this one, this was done really in response to political events that were going on. This was not originally, at least the first one, was not originally done by virtue of just like, oh, we need to come together and put a confession together because we're this new movement. It was the political situation called for it. And so that's why you see like a Benjamin Cox, one of the original signers, handing copies of this out at Parliament during the Westminster Assembly. Right? It's a response to political things that were going on. You just don't see that unification among Baptists. I think because of their unique identity, and of course there were those from the outset who were bent on diverging from what particular Baptists were teaching. So I don't think that's a result of ecclesiology inherently. I think that's just a result of, a result of a lack of associationalism among like-minded churches. So you had people veering off into different theological streams, and I think that break causing there to be this lack of confessional standards. And again, you have the particular Baptists identifying with the Reformed, and you have General Baptists doing their own thing over here, and the Anabaptists doing, their wacky stuff over in somewhere else. So you just see this very disjointed start off for Baptists. But particular Baptists were very much into associationalism and ensuring that each individual church have some sort of connection in an associative way with the other churches to not silo off, and that can help keep these churches unified under one confession. They're submitting to one confession, and they're seeking counsel from one another without one church lording over the other. So I think this can happen with anything. People can take a good principle too far. I don't think it's inherent in Baptist ecclesiology that these things happen, but I do think that there were those who took these principles too far, and you have these silos of theology that come out. Now you jump forward to the modern side, right, where you have your kind of fundy Baptists who don't want anything to do with an overall church tradition. They're independent in name usually, and they want to be separate from everyone else and be their own silo. And so, of course, they're going to come up with their own doctrines, right? They're going to come up with King James onlyism. They're going to come up with usually aberrant views of salvation and strange things that might come out. They're not unifying under some sort of confession, right? They're siloing themselves on purpose. It's by design. So you can see the differences in Baptist ecclesiology, and that's something to point out too. There's not just one mode of Baptist ecclesiology. Historically, you have associationalism among particular Baptists. General Baptists, I think, may have had some sort of associationalism, but independents nowadays, they're independent. They don't want to associate with anyone. They're not part of any particular broader denomination like the SBC. They are their own church. So you're going to find differences there. But I do think that taking the principle of Baptist ecclesiology too far can lead to having a wrong view of ecclesiology. Anyway, that's a long-winded response to Cooper here, but I do think that's important to point out.
Or about the Nicene Creed. This was a debate, and I know there's a lot of political stuff underneath that, and I know it's complicated, the whole issue there. But the point is that within the Baptist tradition, you don't have the same kind of, here is one clear standard by which Baptist theology is to be judged. So for that reason, it's very difficult to have a really clear definition of what Baptists are that we can use then to judge, is this someone authentically in line with the tradition, or is this person not authentically in line with the tradition? And I think that's just kind of an inherent weakness of that particular tradition. And so, if you're talking about someone who affirms one of those confessions, I think it's very different. But Baptist as a label, as a whole, I don't think does have the same kind of unity that you find whether it's a Lutheran or Presbyterian, or even an Anglican, though they're pretty loose in terms of what's affirmed in the 39 Articles as well. But I think some of this comes back to Baptist ecclesiology, because Baptist ecclesiology is by its nature, it's independent. It's very congregationalist. And so even when you have like a binding doctrinal statement from something like the Southern Baptist Convention, the things that the Southern Baptist Convention proclaims and does and decisions that it makes aren't really binding on the individual congregations in the same way that they would be within different traditions.
That is very true. Although one might argue that the SBC does act as a governing body rather than as an association, which at the very least that's up for debate, I think, among Baptists. But the Southern Baptist Convention, I think, has a lot of power and a lot of influence. If not power, it can at least have the quote-unquote peer pressure to make churches do certain things. The SBC provides a lot of benefits for its members. And so I think that there's a lot of pressure there to conform. There is a lot of politics, as if you look on Twitter, you look in different, even in our circles, because there are Reformed Baptists who are part of the SBC. They'll hold to the 1689 and the Baptist Faith and Message together, and they'll immerse themselves in the political arena in the SBC. And you do see a lot of politics going on there, unfortunately. And I think it does take away from the emphasis on the local churches, which ironically the SBC is trying to support. But anyways, it is true that the SBC is not a governing body in the same way that a Lutheran tradition might see some sort of governing body, or like a presbytery in a Presbyterian tradition. So I think that, that's fair. However, I think, again, pointing back to the history of kind of where Baptists came from, I don't think it would have really worked for there to be a unified tradition. It would have been convenient, but I don't think it would have worked. Again, because you have particular Baptists coming out of the Puritan separatist stream, and General Baptists are kind of doing their own thing. They're not part of the Reformed tradition, and so you see them kind of doing their. Anabaptists had already been on the scene at that point for years, and they had made quite a bit of stench in Europe's nostrils. You have the Munster incident. Anabaptists, were not favorable to submitting to local governments, and they had their own weird views on other things that particular Baptists especially were adamantly against, and were very openly against, and said, no, that's not us. We're not those people. Don't lump us in with them. Here's our confession of faith to prove it. And so I think that the history of Baptists doesn't allow for unification. I don't even know if it's really part of the ecclesiology, but more Baptists just did not start off that way based on the situation that they were in politically. And so again, it would have been convenient for that to happen, but I think that you just don't see the same kind of clean cut breakaway that you see with like a Lutheran tradition. So, I mean, even in the Lutheran tradition early on, my understanding is that there was still, like, Luther and Melanchthon didn't always get along on certain things. And it was Melanchthon, not Luther, that carried the torch as it relates to the Augsburg Confession. But, I think the general principle of Lutheranism, confessionally speaking, based on Luther's teachings and the general principle of Lutheranism, is probably there. But two very different historical origins, two very different historical contexts that I think have to be taken into mind when discussing these things. Yes, maybe an ecclesiology may be taken too far in some places, but I do think that a lot of it is just the historical reality that each of these groups found themselves in didn't really allow them to unify under one confessional head. And then, of course, you had differences among Baptists on critical theological issues. So there's different things there.
So there's a kind of looseness in the definitions of what a Baptist is that is just inherent to the Baptist system. And so there's where I think the difficulty is. That's not even a point of critique. I'm just kind of outlining why I think it's the case that it's very easy to maybe dismiss Baptists in a way that it wouldn't be with these other traditions because there isn't a clear standard in precisely the same way. Talking about this kind of, I don't know, maybe opposition that's set up between the high church Protestant groups and then maybe the low church Protestant groups is a lot of our present discussions are really being formed by the particular situation that we're facing right now and the trends that we're seeing in the church. And so the trends that we're seeing in the church are in many ways we are seeing converts from Protestant tradition, especially young male converts, to Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, as numbers have shown, these numbers are not like they're not what we're not seeing is that this kind of turnover, a move from one church tradition to the other, is actually resulting in more growth in Rome or the East than there is in evangelical traditions. It's actually exactly the opposite. So, to some degree, it's been kind of overblown, and I think the internet distorts our way of viewing things. But what a lot of people in the more high church traditions are seeing is that people go from a particular kind of what's called Protestantism, at least, in something that's really not rooted at all, maybe a non-denominational megachurch. We see people going from there and then hearing the claims of Rome or the East, and then they kind of jump over there. And there is no, people aren't even looking at what are the historic Protestant traditions. And so I think there is a tendency for us, because of the nature of the situation we're seeing, to want to say, we are not like them. Look, there are high church Protestant traditions too. Like you don't have to abandon the principles of the Reformation in order to find what you're looking for, in order to.
This is a great point that I think Cooper brings up here. I think, and I'm trying to think about how to say this here. There's a lot packed into this. In our circles, in particular Baptist circles, in particular, I'm noticing this trend from people leaving Baptist theology and jumping to Presbyterianism. And I think I think there are those in quote unquote Protestant traditions who do jump from there to Rome or to the East. And I think it's, talking about that, I think it's because there is no order. They see the smoke and mirrors of it. They see that how fake it is, how shallow it is. And Rome and the East look structured. They have a high liturgy. They seem to take their worship seriously. They seem to be serious about their faith. Ooh, I want to go there, right? There's structure there. There's security there. And I think for Baptists, Reformed Baptists, anyways, I think this might be what's driving people toward, at least in part, toward Presbyterianism from our circles. I think among Reformed Baptists today, you have this kind of low, shallow standard that's set. There's not a huge emphasis on history, church history. There's not a huge emphasis on covenant theology. There's not a huge emphasis on understanding deep theological truths. It tends to be very surface level, unfortunately, if the confession is talked about at all in a meaningful way. So I think this hits home for us, us Reformed Baptists at least, who have, in many cases, abandoned or neglected any traditional understanding of our confessional tradition and neglected anything resembling quote unquote high church practice that we might find among 17th century particular Baptists. Now, I understand there's been recently more recovery, with the doctrine of God. That's definitely more in recent times that has been put more front and center. Covenant theology is another big thing that has been put more front and center in maybe the past 10 years or so in our circles. And so people are learning, and you got to be gracious with people. But there are those who are hostile towards tradition, right? They're still holding on to some of those independent mindsets as it relates to their overall Baptist thinking, if you will. This suspicion for tradition, the suspicion for these old dusty documents called confessions, right? I mean, you have in our circles where you have confessionalism. It tends to be something that's used more as a label rather than a conviction. And sometimes key doctrines in, say, the 1689 are outright denied while claiming to hold to the confession. I point to the doctrine of God again. We see this with guys like Jeff Johnson. I'm just naming names. We've critiqued him on the show. I'm a 1689 card carrying particular Baptist, but divine simplicity as it's no, I don't want that. I believe in this weird version of simplicity I've come up with. I don't want to have anything to do with the historical understanding as it's actually presented. Here's what I think it means, right? So you have people who are outright denying core doctrines that are found in our confession. And then we wonder why people jump ship and jump to the Presbyterians who tend to have it together. I mean, our Presbyterian brethren, I love them. They got their own theological infighting they have to deal with, their own theological problems. I think our Presbyterian brethren like to think they have it more together than is actually happening. But I think they generally have it more structured and settled down in terms of their tradition and their conventionalism, despite their problems. So I think there might be those who see this higher church understanding of things, and they find more. So they see, oh, these confessional Baptists. I mean, this just isn't satisfying me. I'm going to go over here. I think that might be part of it. Another part of it might be just bad theological understanding of these things. And so you neglect them, you reject them, and you move on to a higher church tradition because you're not being taught properly, right? Again, that goes back to that neglecting of tradition that you tend to find, unfortunately, among Baptists in general and even in some particular Baptists today. So I think that, what Cooper's kind of alluding to here, I think is actually correct, that you do see people jumping ship uh, because of they see the shallowness, and so I think that's something that particular Baptists today, Reformed Baptists, need to be aware of, and we need to be dealing with and addressing. We need to continuously go back to our confession because we believe our confession, by and large, is teaching Scripture. Again, we don't believe it's infallible, but we believe that it is a good summary of what the Bible teaches on core matters. So we should be teaching that. We should be going back to it. We should be using it as a standard to help us to understand what the Bible is teaching on certain doctrines. And we need to teach our people these things. Now we have historical materials that help us to do this better. Men who have dedicated so much time to doing this kind of work to bring these things to the layman. You don't have to go to a dingy library in England to pull out these old documents now. You can read them online now. You can buy a book for an affordable price to be able to study them for yourself. So having this drive back to our historical roots, I think, is going to help us to be able to avoid falling into one might call low church Protestantism. Now, I want to talk about that a little bit as it relates to high church, because there is a sense where, yes, in how the word is generally understood, the terminology of high church versus low church, I do think that if you're talking about liturgy, Baptists would fall into that. Even particular Baptists would fall into that to some extent, because we don't have like a flashy liturgy. We don't have a very we don't have a very a structured liturgy in the same way that you would find among a Lutheran, among a Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, maybe even some Presbyterian churches. Oh man, I remember visiting R.C. Sproul's church, St. Andrews in Florida, one time when I was a child, and just the liturgy was very, very ordered, very uh, showy is probably not a good word for it because I don't think they meant anything by it, but it was very high church, and so I think that uh, Baptists don't do that. We tend to be very simple and straightforward. So I do think, in one sense, Baptists are not high church, and even particular Baptists not high church. But I think in another sense, particular Baptists are high church, inasmuch as they do fall within a confessional tradition that defines who they are specifically. And I think that you find particular Baptists being very concerned about the worship of God and going out of their way to make sure that they are worshiping God properly. Example, baptism. Who is the recipient of baptism? What is the mode of it? That all goes back to an understanding of worship because baptism is seen as an act of worship. Even the Lord's Supper and what is to be included in the worship service, right? It has to be done based on the principles of Scripture and those things that are expressly laid out or at least given by example in relation to how God is to be worshiped, right? And there might be certain, and there are, of course, circumstantial things that are not to the substance of worship, but that are circumstances that can be done in light of the general principles of the word. And this is what you see a particular Baptist doing, and that's within the broader Reformed tradition, having an understanding. Scripture regulates worship. So if you're looking at it like in relation to other Baptists today and even historically, I think you could argue that particular Baptists in relation to other Baptists would be considered high church because of the high emphasis they have on worship. And one might even be able to argue that particular Baptists are more high church than maybe Lutherans or Presbyterians, or at least those who hold to the normative principle of worship, because of the regular principle of worship puts such a high emphasis on the worship of God, and I think does more so than the normative principle of worship. Thankfully, our Presbyterian brethren do hold to the regular principle of worship, but we don't believe that they apply that principle consistently. But I think you can define the term high church, low church relative. You can look at it at a high level review in an absolute sense versus, relatively within certain traditions. And again, you might be able to argue that absolutely a particular Baptist tradition is more high church because they have a better emphasis on worship, even if they don't have as flashy of a liturgy. But that's certainly up for discussion. But I do think it's an interesting thing to consider, given how far particular Baptists took the regular principle of worship, and that the regular principle of worship doesn't leave worship up to chance based on what's not in Scripture, but relies on what Scripture teaches expressly and or by example to define what worship is to look like. So I think that you might be able to make that argument. So, kind of bringing this to a close here, Baptists don't have to be boring or rely on weak argumentation. Yes, unfortunately, we have a history of rejecting tradition. We don't like tradition. We historically, at least in modern day, we don't like confessions of faith. Generally, we like to do our own thing. But I think that is hurting us, unfortunately, that Baptists don't have to be boring or rely on weak argumentation. Particular Baptist tradition is full of very scholarly, biblical theology that we can utilize. And then, of course, particular Baptists are putting themselves in line with the broader Reformed tradition on critical matters. And so they're pulling from other giants of the faith on certain matters and not simply relying on their own interpretation of Scripture. I mean, you look at what happened with Nehemiah Cox, who was co-editor of the 1689. In his work, The Discourse of the Covenants, he deliberately left out a discussion on the new covenant. He talks about the Adamic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, and maybe the Davidic covenant. I'd have to go back and check. But he does not go into the new covenant and treat that in its own chapter, because my recollection is because he wanted to point people towards John Owen's work on Hebrews, which he thought was sufficient to deal with the matter. So they're relying on this broader tradition in those places that matter, and they're not kind of siloing themselves over here, right? So Baptists don't have to be boring. We don't have to rely on weak argumentation. We can be intellectual as far as Scripture allows us to. And we have men that have done that for us already. We have this rich tradition that we can pull from. We don't have to rely on nonsense arguments or circular reasoning in order to make our points. We have Scripture, and we have the church, the faith once for all given to the saints that God has given us to be able to pull from. We don't need to be afraid of being intellectuals when used properly. Christianity isn't me and my Bible under a tree. It is working within the faith given once for all to the saints, which requires us to go to other saints to learn it. So I hope this is helpful. I think Cooper made some good points. I would encourage you to go and listen to Gavin Ortland's video too, which Cooper referred to and I think spawned his own video here. So I'm kind of going through this. Cooper's video was spawned by Gavin Ortland. I listened to a good portion of that video, and I'm really riding off the coattails of Cooper here, but I thought he brought up some points. And as a Baptist coming at this and kind of thinking about it from a particular Baptist perspective, and I think he raises some good points here. Anyways, I hope this is helpful. Everyone have a great Lord's Day. We will not be back next week. I have a exam on Saturday morning, so we will not be having an episode next week, but Lord willing, we will be back the week after. Thank you, everyone. Have a great Lord's Day and week, and take care. Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B and subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find more of our podcast content. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist.